Gro Harlem Brundtland, the mother of sustainable development. When listening to Dr. Sachs now, what's your immediate comment, your reaction?
Well, I think first of all, he has been explaining how he himself, took on one and several gradually global agendas. And at that time, at the end of the last century, on global health and environment issues, broadly speaking, and as he said, to realize that the real change has to happen in our governance and awareness with finance ministers, the World Bank, and the business community, everyone on board. Otherwise, the change we need is not going to happen. So basically, I think I can sign up to everything Jeffrey Sachs just said, because we have been having some kind of parallel lives as globetrotters in the causes that we are focusing on today.
It's a rather pessimistic view. Are you kind of disappointed that nothing more has happened over the years since you headed the Commission on Sustainable?
Yeah, but it's not a typical thing for me to be disappointed. It is always thinking, how can we change the scenario? How can we change the way we speak about things, explain things, and how can we engage the public, as Jeff just said? I'm always thinking how to move forward. So I never get into this kind of depression.
No. Disappointment, no.
Yeah.
Arvinn Gadgil, as a young politician, how do you see this perspective looking ahead in the future? It's rather depressing.
Well, I'm very happy that Jeff actually landed on a positive note, although he spent 95% telling us how terrible the world is going to look in the future. And I think it's important to take Brundtland's life wisdom with us as young politicians and focus on what can be done. But I mean, there's one thing that becomes very clear. I was at Doha, and I don't know how many of you, if you could put up your hand if you were in Doha. Asuncion was there. She's the head of the research department at Cicero. She was obviously there, and she's going to speak later today. But this is the fundamental problem. We have a disconnect between the development arena and the climate arena. And connecting these two things is really where the solution lies. But nobody has found a good formula for doing that. And I mean, the reason why I had to leave Doha early was because I had to attend a high-level meeting at the OECD in London, which was scheduled at exactly the same time as the end negotiation part of COP18. I mean, it was a terrible example of how badly coordinated the international society is on this issue. And one thing is looking at the climate data, which I think it's terrifying enough. But another thing is when you start looking for solutions and you try to combine these societies of experts, you realize that there are solutions that come up. For example, the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization has combined to work out an atlas on health and climate. And they put health data on top of climate data, and it makes a lot more sense. And it tells us as policymakers what to do. These are simple things that can be done to join these two arenas, and that's the only way that we can find the right solutions.
You are nodding, Dr. Sachs. Do you agree? Is it combining those two agendas of climate change and poverty? Is that the key?
It is the key, and it's important to understand why it's not being combined right now.
Why has it not been combined?
Yeah, many different levels. First, the poor countries have as their overwhelming sense that they want to achieve development. So that's the starting point. And they fear the green agenda for two reasons. One, they think that it's the rich countries closing the door, saying, we've already gotten there, the world's awfully crowded, you can't have automobiles, you can't burn coal, you can't do other things, you did that to get rich, now you're just keeping us down. That's one very strong view. The second view is of the poor countries, we resent your behavior, rich countries. in two ways. One is you have created this climate change, but never acknowledged it. Now, that's not Europe's problem so much, but it is the US problem centrally, because the US is not present in these discussions now in any serious way. This is itself a long discussion of mostly of a psychoanalytic character, but it's a long issue. The second is you promised to help us with aid. And the promise of 0.7, which this country knows very well, goes back now 52 years. Only 5 countries have achieved 0.7. Of course, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The rest have talked about it for 50 years but never done it. So the level of distrust is very high. This, I think, has to be understood as a major starting point. It's very serious. And the United States fuels this distrust, unfortunately. Let's be clear about it and blunt about it, because if we're not blunt about it, we absolutely will not solve these problems. Now, on the other side, I do think that even Europe, which, you know, I love and admire, has not treated this issue properly from a diplomatic point of view. Because the European view is to the developing countries, why don't you, what's the matter with you? Why don't you just get on the green agenda? You know, you're not listening. And I don't think Europe has taken on properly these matters of distrust, which are very serious. It's not just games. This is the real deal. This is the only planet we have. So we actually have to bridge these divides. Now, there's one more part that I just want to mention, which is that that level of distrust is also fed by one other profound attribute of the international system, which is the typical lack of dealing with solutions. If you look at Doha, it's all about obligations. It's all about who's going to do what, when, or who's got binding obligations, or when we're going to agree. It's, with all respect, it's filled with legalisms. There are almost no engineers at the table. There's almost nobody that actually does solar energy that says, here's what you could do. Here are solutions. And that fuels the distrust because nobody quite knows what they're talking about, unfortunately. In other words, we're arguing about principles pretty heatedly without talking about solutions and practically what to do and how to do it. You know, one of the great bridging opportunities in the world, without question, is massive deployment of solar power in Africa. Because that continent is energy poor generally, impoverished almost everywhere, and has the best endowment of solar power on the whole planet. So if we had a major focus on how to get massive electrification using China's and Europe's and America's know-how on this, we'd actually be talking about something real. But we don't talk about that. So this, I think, is a part of the problem.
Mrs. Brundtland, a lady of solutions and not disappointments. What's your analysis and what's your answer? What to do?
Well, you know, I think Jeff said in his summary now of what's holding back, that even Europe is holding back, you know, on combining the development agenda with the environment agenda. And that's, I think, partly true. However, the reason, I think, is because as long as the US, China, India, and others are holding back, Europe feels too small to do that alone. So it's holding, there are many reasons why things are getting, you know, into that kind of bind. Now, but on the solution part, my feeling is now, Jeff mentions Africa and solar, which is a major effort that needs to be done. But if you look at what the Secretary General's initiatives have been in the later years, the focus on energy, the invitation of Jumkella to become the kind of energy czar of the system, is exactly trying to focus on the solution and to overcome the skepticism and the negativist, approach from many developing countries, because they do understand the essential part that energy plays in the lives of their countries, in the economies of their countries. And so that's one aspect of trying to bridge and to get out to the solutions, because energy is crucial in development as well as in preventing dangerous climate change. So that's one example of the solution thinking, but even that is difficult in the government system of the world. We still have governments. In Doha, although many others come there, the governments are in charge. And they think in terms of principle, in terms of legal and everything, as Jeff said. The same happens at the global level. In the Rio Summit +20, there were many people there. But those in charge were governments. And they created the text. And they are inspired sometimes by positives from others, but it does limit the way the world works. As long as civil society and business is not more fully, directly part of the kind of global negotiation process.
So you see the politicians as obstacles?
No, they are essentials. But they need to understand that any society is public and private. And it's the way, and civil society, it's the way that these kinds of governance systems work together to move forward and to get the solutions. Which is one reason why the Nordic countries have been better than many, is also that we are small enough, with a history of trusting each other, of working across public and private sector and understanding. Whether it's Norway or Sweden, we understand that it is the way we work together to create a better society that gives us the good results. But the full world hasn't really understood it yet. Yeah.
Gadgil, do you agree with Mrs. Brundtland that clean energy could be the bridge that goes in, that creates the practical solutions?
Well, definitely. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that well, we have had now a pretty big push on energy from the development side. The problem is, as Jeff is saying, is that we spend a lot of time finding out the systems globally to roll out energy, but we are finding it difficult in practical terms to actually get the energy projects in place. And this is it's a mystery to me why this happens, but we're doing our best to try to solve it. Energy is obviously one thing. I just want to comment on one thing that Jeff was saying about trust, and I think that's a key thing. My thinking is that the trust that we had in the run-up to Copenhagen was completely shattered. Building that trust again is going to take too many years for this system to be the key for us to solve the problems that we have. So I think that in a sense, we have to give up on trust, not in a total sense, but in the sense of these negotiations, because we have to start doing stuff that shows that we actually mean business.
Can you explain what happened in the run-up to Copenhagen? I mean, what were the key things that led to that rupture?
How did the trust dissolve?
Well, I think we had, well, many of us had a very unrealistic expectation to Copenhagen. We thought we had common goals. When we worked very closely from the Norwegian government with the civil society to try to form our agenda, and we had primary standpoints, but we were very bad at formulating secondary standpoints, fallback positions in the negotiations. We weren't prepared for the fact that a global arena like Copenhagen was as much talking to your local constituency as the meeting itself. So when the plenary was opened, every head of delegation spent their entire time talking to their home constituencies. It was not talking to the negotiations as such, but to their constituencies, and that's the way it continued. And in the end, it was not possible to reach any meaningful solution. I mean, that was a very simple analysis of a very complex process. But if I can just take one analogy, and that's what happened with the MDGs. I mean, you praise the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, as something that the whole world rallied around. The paradox is that the MDG is just about the least democratic thing that the UN has ever done. The MDGs were never negotiated. I mean, I know you were included in it, but they were never negotiated. They never included the vast majority of those who were interested in those questions in the Millennium Summit itself. It was the declaration that was negotiated. The goals themselves were never negotiated. Now we are building a process for the MDGs and to some extent on the SDGs, which is going to be the most inclusive and democratic process ever on the international arena. And I can just see the problems ahead. I'm not against democracy, but I'm for pragmatism, because I agree with you, Jeff, that the only way that these goals are going to be meaningful is that if they need to be measurable, they need to continue on the promise that were made in the original MDGs, but they need to be realistic, at least to a certain extent. They need to push our ambitions, but they need, at the end of the line, to be realistic, and that's a challenge.
But how important is it that now the world decide on some common goal, some sustainable development goal? Is it very important, Dr. Sachs?
In my view, it is important. I think there is something special about the fact that we have a shared set of goals and we can move towards them because the world agrees on very little. And so if we do agree on something, it makes a difference, especially if the goals are clearly put. Then I think it can make a big difference. If it is a Christmas tree with lots of ornaments on it of dozens or hundreds of goals and targets. But that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? It may be a wonderful thing to behold, but it won't actually do much more than be beheld for a short period of time. They need to be succinct, clear, to the point. Now, I was not part of the original process of setting the goals. I was asked to come in after they were promulgated to help figure out practically what to do. But it is interesting that the goals themselves were part of the Millennium Declaration, of course, but not even identified as MDGs until a year after the declaration was set. And then world leaders were told, oh, by the way, you did adopt in that declaration 8 goals. Almost all the world, I'll just tell one vignette, which many of you know, but not everybody. I think it's interesting. Almost all the world said, oh, fine, okay. Many thought they'd go away, they'd be harmless, some liked them, many didn't, but whatever it was, 8 goals. There was one government that objected to this terribly. That was the United States. We never signed Millennium Development Goals. We only accept international development goals, including those in the Millennium Declaration, but they refused the phrase Millennium Development Goal until 2005, when the US ambassador brought the whole world together. Not exactly the way he thought, but Mr. Bolton came in as President Bush's ambassador, and in the draft summit outcome for 2005, struck out the phrase Millennium Development Goals about 700 times from the document. And the whole rest of the world, the other 191 countries at the time, rose up in unison and said, we love the Millennium Development Goals, and told Kofi Annan, we will have no summit unless the MDGs are there. And the US backed down, and that's how we got global unanimity on the MDGs. So I always thank Ambassador Bolton for his major contribution to this process.
Mrs. Brundtland, what should be the main focus on the new Sustainable Development Goals?
You know, I'm deliberately withholding my opinion on it. Why? Because exactly the processes that have been set in motion, it's important that, in fact, Rio +20 decided to call for those goals. That's the most important stepping stone. Then the parallel processes which Jeff has described are a problem. However, they are a reality already, and they have to do with the preparation before Rio, the host of Brazil, the other countries having different opinions about green economy and about everything. So that there was a sensitivity very much before Rio, but the most important thing is it was in fact placed in the document. So now the challenge is to find how and when to be able to merge these processes in some way. I have advised the panel of Cameron, the Liberian president, and the Indonesian that they should go for it, you know, because they are now an independent panel. They have already been selected. There are people on board there. They need to think about how they can contribute constructively, because they come out in the end with one voice on this. They have to, although they have very brief time. Because the processes of the 30 countries that are supposed to be working on this, that process is slow, difficult. They don't agree yet on the mandate fully. And whoever knows what happens in an intergovernmental process like that. So the panel has an important responsibility, and of course the Secretary General. Now, if you go back then to the description of the Millennium Development Goals, one reason why we succeeded in simplifying and getting the 8 goals was a very good collaborative process across the UN system itself, led by Kofi Annan. Because during those years, when that was developed, there was quite an effort to work across the different institutions of our UN system to help Kofi Annan with following up on the declaration and moving in a serious way. Because when all of us, you know, were behind those 8, it did work. And the competition between different parts of the system was put aside for the common good. And we managed in that sense. I'm not sure now it would have been as easy, because now the Rio process is already there. The decisions in the declaration from Rio, the processes so the system, they have to be working together along those panels and with the Secretary General to do whatever is possible. The most important thing is that, yes, we agree on certain key sustainable development goals, not on 50 or 15 even. It should be smaller than that. I would hope that one key issue is energy. This is because of the direct link between environment, development, and overcoming of poverty. So, but that's just one thing I think should be there to be able to grasp.
But if it should cover all countries, then
yes,
it will be a lot more demanding task.
Yes, and I think that has to happen. This is also in the panel, the Global Sustainability Panel that I was on, where we suggested sustainable development goals and gave some indications, but we were careful because of the difficulty of the Rio process up to Rio happening. But still, we are very clear they should be universal goals this time. Sustainable development can only be achieved as a universal common goal.
Dr. Sachs, in your kind of dark picture of today's world, you didn't say so much about the tax evasion, tax havens, and illicit financial flows. How serious threats are these to sustainable development?
I'm sorry, the financial?
Illicit financial flow.
Illicit financial flows, yeah.
And tax havens, tax evasions. We have in the news the last days about big international corporations having tax management, meaning they hardly pay any taxes.
We've created, of course, a system that is extraordinary in that it has allowed for tens of trillions of dollars to be put outside of not only tax control, but I would say accountability on many standards. These tax havens are not, they're not, how should I say, escaping from the international system. They were designed by the international system. They were created first and foremost by the United Kingdom in the first half of the 20th century, and then by the United States afterwards. And we're all part of this makeup now. We had a presidential candidate whose wealth was in the Cayman Islands. We never found out too many details. Fortunately, he didn't become president also. But it was an extraordinary spectacle to have a person who has made his whole wealth be part of this system. So it's not an illicit system, it's a licit, horrible system. It's very consequential because it is in combination with globalization really almost a death trap for taxation at this point, with the race to the bottom across many, many countries. And we're seeing the current estimates are between 10 and $20 trillion of wealth parked in the Caribbean, in the Channel Islands, and a few other places. When you look at China's outward foreign investment, they have already learned how to maximize this process, because China's biggest foreign investment goes through Hong Kong or through the Caribbean, not directly into the major economies. Now, one of the things that this does is create a veil of anonymity and unaccountability, not only for tax, but also for other areas of corporate responsibility. When you look at abuses in Africa of land grabbing, of concessions, of bribing, typically it's a Cayman Island post office box, not a company that you could identify. And so these are veils that also protect large money interests behind an anonymous facade. And it's so abusive, so outrageous, that if we take it on, it will go away actually over time. No doubt the interests are large, but there's no justification for it. No one could say that the Cayman Islands actually requires $2 trillion of deposits. This is an insanity by any standard, except massive evasion of social responsibility. So my answer is very significant and very much should be on the target for ending this abusive system.
So this is a threat to sustainable development.
Oh, it's an extraordinary threat. I mean, I mean, this is daylight robbery. But this, we can so hide it in all sorts of diplomatic language and call it, you know, illicit financial flows or whatever. But it's daylight robbery of poor countries and poor people every single day. And I have the privilege of being a member of the African Union high-level panel on illicit financial flows. I'm one of 8 members there, headed by President Thabo Mbeki. And we will release a report in the beginning of next year which will show the extent of the problem. And these are very conservative numbers. We're looking at numbers of between $1 and $2 trillion that have disappeared out of the African continent every year. Every year. And this obviously dwarfs development aid. Development aid doesn't even show on that chart if you compare them. So these are massive numbers. And there are several aspects to this that we have to remember. One is the secrecy issue. Another is the size of the financial economy. I mean, in 1992, if you look at the currency exchange, size of the currency exchange market, it was about 8 to 9 times the real economy. That in itself is absurd to me. Today, that number is 40. The currency exchange market is 40 times as big as the real economy of the globe. How is that possible? And there's certainly something wrong with this. We have to handle it. And I can see, I'm looking at the Deputy Minister, Honorable Deputy Minister from Zambia. It's a perfect example of a country that's really, you know, taken a hold on this issue. In 2007, 2008, I think there was a big tax reform in Zambia where they tried to stop the loopholes. I think it raised something like $200 million that year. It was, Norway was part in that partnership. Very catalytic aid, spend little money for Zambian authorities to actually repatriate that lost tax income. And the estimates are something along the range of $1 billion lost every year from the Zambian tax system. And this is not only illicit financial flows, this is just, some would say happenstance, bad or insufficient regulation or enforcement of regulation, but I'm sure the Honourable Minister will talk to that later. But this is key. I mean, any other discussion on development is absolutely minuscule in importance compared to this. And when I talked to the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee last week on this, I look at this table full of question marks. This worries me. Nobody has put this highly on the agenda on the development side. A lot of finance ministers care about this, but on the development side, nobody really takes it seriously. But we are now, ramping up our efforts on this and trying to build alliances internationally to bring this topic on the agenda much more forcefully. I mean, obviously, this is also a problem for rich countries, but for developing countries, it's daylight robbery.
It's being Mr. Brundtland.
Well, I'm fascinated by the dimensions of the numbers you are giving, and it's surprising to me that the development ministers have not been so interested in it. I think that was the biggest surprise than what I just heard. But when you think about it, probably they think they have so much on their agenda, and this is too complicated, so leave it, But it's not a good idea. No.
Let me continue with you, Ms. Brundtland. We will have to wrap up soon, but one very big question I would like you to address, and that's that the majority of poor people now live in middle-income countries. How to address that problem?
Well, maybe the fact that the economic crisis for later years have also hit formerly, rich countries or middle-income countries that have felt that they already were secured, for the future, can help overcome some of the resistance against the kind of change that redistributes resources in a different way. I mean, the fact that, as Jeff was saying, continuously rising inequalities across the world is a dramatic scenario that has basically happened over the last 30 years or so. It was not any kind of issue of that kind back in the 80s when we did the report and analyzed.
Then poor people lived in poor countries.
I mean, generally, yes, much more of that picture. And now we have seen these dramatic increases in rich people's fortunes and incomes in so many countries, especially the US, but it has spread across the world. But also the other issue, how many rich people there are in poor and middle-income countries. And they are not willing to pay taxes the way we had to do in Europe, if you go 100 years back. To bring our populations out of poverty, people had to pay taxes who had middle or high incomes. They haven't fully understood that in many countries yet, at least not how to deal with it. So many countries don't have a functioning tax system. And so it's a dramatic scenario, but I mean, on the panel on global sustainability, many of the members from developing countries in the middle range, they realize that this is a major problem, but they are not very happy about talking about it still. So it is an issue that is part of global debate that we have to take seriously. And I do think the fact that poverty is reinserting itself in countries where it was gone, basically, can help us be able to link together in a more combined effort of thinking what needs to be done, and that it is really something that both rich and poor countries have a shared problem addressing.
Arvinn, and then Sachs in the end.
And this is a very key point that's been raised. I mean, it's difficult for my minister to go to Parliament and ask for development aid for a country that is not willing to tax its own super rich people. I mean, development aid does not have a political base anymore if these countries do not tax their rich and you know, middle-income people. So this is a key issue. The inequality issue is, I mean, there's no worse example than the U.S. Of course, I just read that if you add the wealth of the 6 heirs of the Walmart imperium, that adds up to the wealth of the 100 million poorest people in the US. 6 people, just as much as 1/3 of the US in wealth. But many countries are going in that direction. I mean, you see the only 2 places in the world where the inequalities are broadly decreasing is Latin America, which is, I mean, they came from a very bad point to begin with. I mean, the largest inequalities in the world. And then you have Norway, where inequalities have been dropping, except for a period between, I think, late 90s and the mid-2000s. But this is a fundamental challenge for development policy. And rightly, as you said, I mean, how do we reconcile the fact that 70% of the poorest people in the world live in middle-income countries? I think my answer to that question is that we need to use our aid in a way that is, I use that word catalytic, not because it's a buzzword, but because it makes sense. In that if you use our aid in middle-income countries in a way that middle-income countries themselves are able to raise income, then our aid is meaningful in these contexts. Then, of course, you have the bottom billion and you have those left behind, which we still need to aim at reaching with aid. But the key thing for me is to work closely with middle-income countries who want to take on some of this agenda and see how our small money can help them mobilize more.
And the last word goes to you, Dr. Sachs.
I think we should understand that statistic just a little bit, because basically what happened was that 3 big countries got reclassified from low income to lower middle income: India, Indonesia, and Nigeria. So what that statistic is saying is that there are a tremendous number of poor people in India, in Indonesia, and in Nigeria. That's the overwhelming aspect of that fact. Now, how can one take that? Well, one part of good news, of course, is that India and Indonesia have been achieving, and Nigeria for that matter, have been achieving some economic growth. So that's a positive. That means that there's a base. It also means that those 3 countries have a level of income that they could already mobilize to do more than they are doing to address poverty within their own countries. And this means that, as we just heard, that if those 3 countries use their tax system appropriately, they have a high enough level of income. It's not rich, but it's lower middle income status, maybe $1,000 to $1,500 per capita, that they could be addressing issues more effectively than they have till now. I think the good news is that all 3 are trying to do that, actually, but with big challenges. So India has chronically underinvested in public health, for example, but one of the happy outcomes of the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, which included Manmohan Singh at the time, being in between finance minister and prime minister, is that when he became prime minister, he launched a major effort for scaling up public health. And that's called the National Rural Health Mission, and it's making important inroads, though they could even do more than that. With respect to Nigeria, it's notable that when Nigeria negotiated a partial repayment of debt to cancel the overhang of debt, it devoted $1 billion per year of the savings on debt to an MDG fund, which to this day is investing. Now that country is so complicated and so under-institutionalized at the local level that delivering these services locally is a tremendous, tremendous challenge for Nigeria. And of course, the history of impunity, corruption, mismanagement of oil, and tremendous excesses of the foreign companies is another matter. I wrote recently about the fact that the oil spills in the Niger Delta have been, over the last 40 years, twice the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, but no international company's ever borne any responsibility whatsoever for this devastating pollution. And those companies should put in billions of dollars. They should be taxed, charged, or take corporate responsibility to do that, to clean up the mess that they have willfully created over the past 40 to 50 years. Finally, Indonesia is another case of economic growth with the president that's committed to reinvesting those growth dividends into broader-based development. It's a complicated country of more than 10,000 islands, and so it's not simple in any of these three countries. The point is that statistic can be looked at in a positive way also, meaning that countries that were poor and now have achieved a certain higher level of income per capita have greater means to address the remaining pretty deep levels of poverty in those countries. I do think that aid should be directed mainly at the low-income countries, not at the middle-income countries. Even if poverty is heavily in middle-income countries, we can give advice, cajoling, congratulations, encouragement, but the money that's urgently needed in aid, in my view, should go to the poorest of the poor countries that can't do it on their own, no matter what they try, because they're in such dire conditions that even if they tried, they couldn't fund a health system on their own, for example. But I do think we can give encouragement, and closing the tax havens would also give a big boost as well.
Okay, I thank you so much. It was great to have you here, and do not leave the stage before I have given you a gift. And Gro, I know you are going skiing over the Christmas season. Yes, and I hope you will bring it back to cold New York, and Arvinn, you can use it in Oslo. So thank you very much, all of you.